Now the next thing I have for us is a series of messages that I've entitled The Men Behind the KJV. Parts 1, 2, 3, and so forth. Now I realize I don't have anything to gain in making this as lengthy as I can, so that's exactly what I'm going to try not to do. I've already tried to condense 2 messages into one. I didn't completely do that, but I was fairly successful last time in doing that. So I'm just going to go along because we're going to look at each of the men here in a few moments. It'll take us a while to get into that. A few more things to say at the end of the earlier message. And I'm just going to go along at a pace that I hope won't be too fast for you, of getting down the names and getting down the background and so forth. Remember, we're talking about 50 different men here. So that's why I could have a parts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and on and on and on. But I don't have anything to gain from that. Biblical literature, at least in this part of our studies, is strictly a historical study. Doesn't mean it's not important, but it's strictly historical. It doesn't have the theological type of importance that something like textual criticism or canonicity would have. It's important to know something about these translations, but the translations, as they already have been, are just piling and piling and piling up on top of us, and it's impossible to remember all of them and all of their dates and everything. I just want to acquaint you in general with these translations, and we still have so many to go in the modern world, 20th century English translations. The men are appointed to their work in July of 1604. Some of the men began preliminary private work on the KJV. And continued so up until 1607. But this later date was the date for the formal beginning of the translating work, which the men basically did in their spare time. Let's be sure to characterize this work on the KJV as a part-time job. These men came from various religious backgrounds, and they were still involved in those religious positions. Bishops, pastors, readers, lecturers, professors, deans, archbishops, and so forth. They couldn't just quit that. Say, well, for the next 3 years, the next 4 years, I'll just quit being a deacon or quit being a bishop or quit being an archbishop. That would be impossible. They had their regular activities that they had to maintain, such as pastoring some church in southern England. So let's characterize this work as a part-time job. The major part of the work was done in the first 3 of those 7 steps I gave you last time. That was the major part of the work. Of each person had to do each verse, and they went through the reviews before it actually went to the committees. The major part of the work, the first 3 steps, this will be in your notes from last time, was completed in 2 years, 1609. You can look back in your notes and find which points I'm talking about. I really don't want to take the time to review that. But the first 3 points were completed in 2 years by 1609. Then the committee of either 6 or 12, either 1 or 2 from each of the 2 groups in the 3 places, or there might be a disproportionate scattering of them. That was step 4, took another 9 months. This was after all the groups had completed all of their books. Step 4. Then a draft would be taken before a general, smaller assembly. Trying to show you the time. In other words, from 1607 to 1611, we're not talking about that actually being the period during which all of the translation was done. We're really through with translating in a remarkably short period of time, 2 years, from 1607 to 1609. Then the review of the committee, step 4, takes another 9 months, so that puts us up into 1610. And then the final editors, the typesetters, the printers, take a few more months, when the work is finally printed in 1611. That is a little more precise, and about as precise as we're going to get, of a chronological outline of the KJV. Earlier I just gave you 1604, 1607, 1611. Preliminary work, official work, the conclusion, matching those 3 dates respectively. Now we have it broken down with the 1609 thrown in there for the work is through, a 1610 for the committee being through with the rough draft, and then another year or so with the 2 final editors, Miles Smith and Thomas Bilson, the typesetters, the printers, and so forth to do their work. It finally comes out in 1611. Next thing on our agenda is to discuss the subject of their remuneration. Now this issue is not totally clear in the records, but here's what appears to have been the case. King James was a spendthrift. The treasury is empty. Parliament has no extra money to allot to pay for these men and the work that they're doing on the translation. So we've discussed it as a part-time job before. Now we're discussing what did they get in return for this work. King doesn't have any money. Parliament is not free to allot any extra money. So thankfully, the men just didn't throw up their hands and say, well, we're just going to head back home and not do this. We still got our Bible out of it all. Here's what appears to have taken place as far as this whole question of remuneration, the payment of these men. And I've got it in 5 different points that I want to give you. It's a little bit confusing and it chases various rabbits. Here's one thing that we know that took place. King James asked Bishop Bancroft to look into finding any open £20 a year prebends. First step here, talking about how these men get paid. Where'd the money come from? King has none. Parliament has none. Some of these men don't have a lot of money. They're away from their local church. They're away from home. So how did they get paid? Well, first thing is the king asked Bancroft to look into prebends. Prebends was like a stipend, a church stipend. Just remunerative livings. It didn't actually cover the cost of the translation. It just paid them somewhat, was to pay them somewhat for their services. Now, let's translate to show you what type of money we're talking about here. £20 prebends or stipends. You've probably heard of these. They're religious. Well, they're not. They don't have to be religious terms. But they're often used in a religious connection. Let's translate this into purchasing power in the 1980s. £1 has the purchasing power of $1987. So what we're talking about is $1,000 then. This was the assignment of Bancroft, to look into. In other words, churches would offer these out. Churches had money. You'll find churches today, churches that have some type of financial backing. They'll have scholars in residence and preachers in residence and all of this, where they have money that's allotted for visiting a lecture or something. It depends on how good or maybe how intellectually, academically inclined the church is, but various scholarly groups have things like this, where you can go for a week or a month and be given a stipend or a prebend. So he was to search out for any ones that were open, that is, prebends or stipends, church stipends that were not already taken, already being paid out to someone else for some other reason. And King James suggested £20 ones, which would translate into $1,000, £20 a year, that is, $1,000. The Archbishop of York and the bishops in the See of Canterbury were also to look for some £20 a year prebends. But they were unsuccessful in finding any. And anyway, these are simply remunerative livings, did not cover the actual cost of the translation. So this didn't work. That was suggested by the king in their original meetings. You can scratch number 1. That didn't work. Secondly, on July the 30th, 1604, Bishop Bancroft, or really he's going to become the Archbishop now, Archbishop Bancroft, we might still call him Bishop because that's generally what he's thought of since he worked so long under Whitgift. Bancroft, in a letter to the Bishop of Norwich, said that although the king was ready to foot the bill, quote, from his own princely disposition, unquote, which, in fact, he didn't have and he didn't do. Reality necessitated that all bishops and deans and the clergy in general needed to chip in. So what we're seeing here in the beginning is a scramble by some of these men to find money, to secure some money, to secure these translators. I mean, that's one of the first things you ask, I assume, whenever you go on a job. Not, am I going to get paid, but what am I going to get paid? These men, the question was, are we going to get paid? It wasn't even a question of what yet. It's a question of, are we going to get paid? They don't really want to go and just work for free for years. Of course, it's part-time. You're there and then back home, there, then back home, and there a while, then back home a while, and then so forth. You alternate. But these men are scrambling. James says that we ought to look for prebends. Bancroft, writing a letter to the Bishop of Norwich, said that the king's ready to foot the bill, quote, from his own princely disposition, unquote, which he really doesn't have and didn't do. Reality necessitated, however, that the bishops and deans, the clergy in general needed to chip in. The church, the king doesn't have money, Parliament doesn't have money. Number 3, the churches don't have allotted prebends or stipends. Number 4, Bancroft thinks, well, the only other alternative is all the clergymen in England need to chip in. He estimated the need of 1,000 marks. 1 mark equaled 2/3 of a pound. So you can translate that with 1 pound equaling $50. 1 mark equal 2/3 of a pound. 1 pound equal $50. He estimated the need of 1,000 marks. He told the Bishop of Norwich that he would tell the king, in other words, they were going to get some favors probably shown from the king. He would tell the king how much each clergyman gave if they would just give. But the result of number 2 was A, Bancroft's estimate was far too low for all of these men, for all of these months. And B, and more to the point, in fact, no one gave a single cent. Remuneration proceedings are not going very well, are they? The king has no money, Parliament has none, the churches have none, the clergymen have none, the parishioners obviously have none. So, we're to point 3 now. Therefore, the men only received free room and board at Westminster, Cambridge, and Oxford while they did their work. In other words, they had to survive on their own regular income, which was oftentimes simply not livable. It's part-time work, remember, so many would work during the week at one of 3 places, Westminster, Cambridge, or Oxford, then travel back to their churches to preach on Sunday mornings. So this is an interesting thing that you probably didn't know about the KJV, did you? It was a part-time, no-pay job. It's a part-time, no-pay job. They gave us this masterpiece of English literature. worked on it part-time during the week, and went back to preach in their churches on Sunday mornings. And they didn't receive a cent for doing it. Free room and free board. But that's really nothing. It certainly wasn't comparable for the work that they've done. Fourth point I want to add on here, the only man to actually receive any money, above free room and board, the only man to actually receive any money, and he received it from the king, and we'll come across this man later, it was one Andrew Downs. Andrew Downs. D-O-W-N-E-S. He worked on the Apocrypha group, of all things. And the only reason he received any is because he wrote a letter to the king and begged for some. I guess it's you ask till you receive. You have not because you ask not. The king secured for him 50 pounds. A couple of $1,000. 50 pounds. Okay, if you're ready for a fifth point here, we're still under remuneration. A different set of circumstances prevailed for that final committee of the 6 or 12 men. That's a different matter. We separate that from the translation work in general. Different set of circumstances prevailed for this final committee that took the draft, the 6 men or the 12 men. Rather than being located at one of the earlier 3 places of Westminster, Cambridge, or Oxford, these all came to London and were quartered in the Stationers' Tower. They didn't do their work at Westminster, Cambridge, or Oxford. They did their work, the rough draft committee of 6 or 12 men did their work in Stationers' Tower. Station, just like it sounds, Stationers' Tower. Here they were finally paid an actual wage. Now these 6 or 12 men who served on this committee were also men who did translating work, but they're not paid for the translating work, rather for their review work on the committee. They were paid 30 shillings per man per week for those 9 months. They were paid 30 shillings per man per week for the 9 months the committee met. In buying power for today, that would be about $75 per week for each of the men. Now, since we can't find any sources for money earlier, I wonder what the source was for this money. There's been a lot of debate through history of what was the source for this money to pay these men. If you could come up with this, why couldn't you come up with more for the whole group? The king? Certainly not. He was bankrupt. Parliament? No, they would not allot any more. The churches didn't have any. The clergymen contributed not a dime, or not a mark, or not a shilling. What about the stationers? Perhaps so. There are 2 guesses. One would be the stationers, the people who operated this tower. We know in history that the stationers had given 125 pounds toward the founding of a colony in Virginia, and later would give another 45 for the same purpose. So what little we know about these people, and that is not a lot, we do know that they were people of resources. We know that, in other words, they were concerned about religious matters. The founding of a colony in Virginia was because of religious persecution. And they gave 125 pounds. Now that's, as you can see, many thousands of dollars in buying power today. and later would give another 45. So perhaps this money came from the stationers. Another suggestion is that it may have been forwarded to them by the printer, who was already licensed to produce the work, because the royal license was in his family, and that was Robert Barker. Now, he obviously has to have some money to do all the printing. He's not going to pay for it himself. So then the question would be further, where he get the money? Well, surely that had to come through the government. Maybe they saw, well, these men, we're going to make them work for free. But the printer's not just going to print all of that up and not charge anybody something. He's got to have some money to get going, and then once he makes some money on selling all this, well, then that's another matter. All right, all of that's just historical tidbits, not of that much importance. Let's move on. Pick up here midway through tonight, the Men Behind the KJV, Part 1. Now, details about many of these 57 total men are not known. For a few of these, however, we have quite a bit of information, and others fall somewhere in the middle of little information and much information. But I'll simply give you what I've been able to discover. And here's the way we're going to do this. We're going to take each of the 3 places, beginning with Westminster, and we'll look at each of the 2 groups in those 3 places, 6 groups in their entirety. We'll look at the men that fit under those 2 groups. Now, for some of these men, like Lancelot Andrewes, we've discussed before, Harding we've discussed before, Edward Lively we've discussed before, Miles Smith, Thomas Bilson, and so forth. I won't duplicate what I've said earlier, but I'll give you additional information. But sometimes when we come across their name now, we may need to say more about them that we'll say later. So once we put it all together, we'll know all that I've been able to discover, all that's pertinent that I've been able to discover about these 57 total men. Follow that? Start with Westminster, go through the 3 places and the 2 groups in each one. So we'll stay with Westminster and do the 2 groups first of all. So I'll show you how I have it in my notes, and you may want to outline yours similarly. Roman numeral 1, Westminster. Which had the Old Testament committee of 10 men, plus the New Testament committee of 7 men, which gives us 17 total men at Westminster. I gave you the divisions. It must have been last time. Westminster has Old and New Testament, Oxford has Old and New, and Cambridge has Old and Apocrypha. 17 total men. And we'll start with the Old Testament group that was responsible for, here's the first time you've seen this information, that was responsible for Genesis through Kings. Now we're going to know what sections of the Bible were done by which men. And then what we will do, I guess, is just start listing these men. But I don't think I'll just list. I'll give you number 1 and we'll start discussing. Now, it'll be impossible to remember where all of these fit. 2 groups in 6 places of 57 men, but then there was 54, but then there was 47, but then there was 48, but then there were 9 more, back to 57 there. It's impossible to remember all of that. So copy what you think is interesting, and you're even free to sleep if you want to. I'll try to keep my eyes on my notes so I won't have my feelings offended. Number 1, the first man here under the Old Testament committee that did Genesis to Kings, Lancelot Andrewes. And I'll also tell you who was the chairman of each committee. I guess it's generally going to be the first one. Lancelot Andrews is the chairman. He was born in 1555. He died in 1626. When I have those dates, I will give them to you. Many times I won't have them. Which means he was 49, and I'll give you this, I computed it for you, at the time of the work. And I'll date this to 1604. They began at least preliminary work. So you'll know around how old we're talking about for these different people. He's 49 years old. He held a doctor's degree, and his title at this time was Dean of Westminster. So the Old Testament group at Westminster, you've got old at all three, remember. The Old Testament group at Westminster was chaired by Lancelot Andrews, one of the most brilliant men of his day. He was the speaker of 15 languages, remember. He was the one who took vacations to find new tongues to learn them. He took vacations to meet foreign people to learn a new language, and that's what he counted as a vacation. And he spoke 15 different languages fluently. He also, we have seen him earlier, was one of the 3 men to oversee the selection of all of the translators. Remember, James appointed a committee of 3 men, Harding, Lively, and Andrews, to oversee the selection of the other 51 men, or the other 55 men. They met in his deanery at Westminster. Now, you see, this says something about him and his situation. He had a very convenient time here. They worked at Westminster. That's where he held a job at Westminster. He has no travel involved at all. Each of these things like this will tell us something about the man. Some had to travel a further distance than did Andrews. Here are the things that are interesting that I've picked up about Lancelot Andrews in addition to what I've given you before. Remember the gunpowder plot to overthrow the fellow that had hidden the stuff under the blow? And the fellow's name was Guy Fawkes, remember? He preached, Lancelot Andrews preached 10 Guy Fawkes sermons for the king. Guy Fawkes sermons means that, you would, well, I'll give you an example here in just a minute. But he preached 10 Guy Fawkes sermons before the king during 1 year, drawing out implications from the gunpowder plot. One message he preached was to show you also what preaching was like in this day. It hasn't changed much, I'm sad to say. All this allegory and types and shadows and symbols. Psalm 118, verse 24. This is the day which the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. He taught that verse referred to the gunpowder plot's failure. That this is the day that the Lord has made, when the Catholics failed to overthrow Parliament and the king. It's a misapplication of Scripture, to be sure. Total misapplication of Scripture. But that's one of the texts he used in one of his 10 sermons. He was very brilliant, a leading high churchman, a close friend of the king's. He went to horse races with the king. Very kind, very warm, very generous, very balanced in his views. He had a certain altercation in his life with a heretic that ended up dead under his approval. Dutch-born Bartholomew Legate, Legate, like the Syrian legates. Bartholomew Legate taught that Jesus was only a man. There was no virgin birth, no incarnation. And Andrews, with another of the translators, was the man who approved this heretic's death. who was burned at the stake March the 18th, 1611. Andrews, of course, is particularly important to know about because he's the chairman of this group. He's the chairman of what, as you sit down and read Genesis to Kings, this is the man who's the chairman of that. He'd be the man most responsible for that whole section in the KJV. He'd be the man in that committee who has final say-so over it. And because of his demonstrated brilliance that we pointed out before, he was oftentimes so perfect in his own translations that no one could improve upon it. So that the translation they took to represent that group would be, although they all had done it, would be that of their chairman, Lancelot Andrews. Now that's not always true. Sometimes you have a man who's more brilliant as a member of the group rather than the chairman himself. But this man, the one that we know as Lancelot Andrews, is the one who almost personally is responsible for Genesis through Kings. All right, a second man, William Bedwell. He was born 1562. He died 1632. He was 42 at the time of the work. He was a Mr. I'll tell you whether they were Doctor or Mr. He was a Mr. He taught at St. John's College. Biography of him: he was a father of Arabic studies in England. And while translating the KJV, he was working on a famous Arabic lexicon that would come out after the KJV, that would be used by many people after that day. So in other words, he would be a good one to be working in the Old Testament because of his familiarity with Semitic languages. This Oriental scholar was also a great mathematician. He had a huge library filled with books on math and astronomy. So maybe he's the one who worked out some of those chronological mathematical problems back there in the Pentateuch. Men who had specialties in certain areas were certainly the ones assigned to certain areas in the corpus of their translation work. He was the only translator known to have traveled outside of England after 1611. So what in the world does that prove or matter? Well, nothing, I guess. But I've scoured the books looking for information about these men, and sometimes you're grasping for straws because you can't find much. So we know he was the only translator known to have traveled outside of England after the publication of the KJV, and that was to the Netherlands. And he went there to view a famous Arabic book collection. Number 3, Francis Burleigh. B-U-R-L-E-I-G-H. He was a doctor at Pembroke Hall. He was a doctor at Pembroke Hall. Number 4, Richard Clark. End his last name with an E. Richard Clark, doctor, fellow at Christ's College. He was a famous preacher in this group, and he taught on an island off the Thames River mouth. So he had a little ways to come by boat to get into Westminster to do his work. Richard Clark. Number 5, Jeffrey King. I know that he died in 1630. He was a Mr. At the time of the KJV, he was a fellow at King's College. The way I hope you're doing this is just, write down his name, Smith, and what is he, a doctor, then where did he teach, at Pembroke, and so forth, just across the line. If I've got his years, his dates, then you can put that down. A fellow at King's College. After the translation had begun, he became a royal professor of Hebrew at Cambridge. That was after the work had begun. He became a royal professor of Hebrew at Cambridge. By the way, it was during all of that boring spare time down at Gordon Conwell, and I couldn't find anything else to do. I'd already finished my work, that I scoured all the books looking for this information. So if it kind of has if it reeks of academia, it's probably because I was living in those walls down there. That's why I have all the doctors and dates and the college names. Number 6, John Layfield. 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 John Layfield. 1563 to 1617. He was 41 at the time of the work. He was a doctor. He was a rector at St. Clement Danes, a London church. A rector at St. Clement Danes, Danes, a church in London. At 41, he happens to be one of the younger men involved. Not the youngest, but one of the younger men involved. The unique biographical note about him is that he actually traveled to the New World, the West Indies, during the last decade of the 1500s. So he had traveled to a greater distance than had any of the other translators. He had actually been over to the Americas, the West Indies, during the 1590s. In his writing entitled Purchase His Pilgrims, he describes in great detail and with obvious delight all that he saw and experienced over in the exotic West Indies. And that work, Purchase His Pilgrims, which is just a travel narrative, is the only non-spiritual writing from all of the translators. You see how many of these details you remember 6 months from now. It is the only non-spiritual writing from all of the translators. Now we can say something else about this man. Even more than his chairman, Andrew Downes, or Lancelot Andrews. There's another man, Andrew Downes. He loved to write. Layfield loved to write in exact, simple, precise words, in a very precise manner. He also happened to be skilled in architecture. Now, when you put those points together, you might ask yourselves, well, who would be a better translator of all those portions in Exodus 25 to 40 about the building of the tabernacle? Turn with me to Exodus 36, verses 20 to 38. From what we know about this man, chapter 36, verses 20 to 38 of Exodus, what we know of Layfield, this could well have come from his hand. He was very precise, very simple, non-verbose. I mean, uses few words and just choose just the right word and just keep on hammering away And speaking of hammers, he was skilled in architecture. Exodus 36, beginning with verse 20, going down however far we need to go. Now, have you not had troubles getting through some of these chapters before? And he made boards for the tabernacle out of shittim wood, standing up. The length of a board was 10 cubits, and the breadth of a board 1 cubit and a half. One board had 2 tenons, equally distant one from another. Thus did he make for all the boards of the tabernacle. And he made boards for the tabernacle, 20 boards for the south side southward, and 40 sockets of silver he made under the 20 boards, 2 sockets under one board for his 2 tenons, and 2 sockets under another board for his 2 tenons. And for the other side of the tabernacle, which is toward the north corner, he made 20 boards, and there are 40 sockets of silver, 2 sockets under one board, and 2 sockets under another board. And for the sides of the tabernacle westward, he made 6 boards, and 2 boards made he for the corners of the tabernacle in the 2 sides, and they were coupled beneath, and coupled together at the head thereof to one ring. Thus he did to both of them in both the corners. And there were 8 boards, and their sockets were 16 sockets of silver, under every board 2 sockets and onward. He was skilled in architecture. He would have loved to write something about this. He would have understood more than the general person understands about all these sockets and boards and joints. He would have followed all of that. He was an architect. And he loved to write in, not flowing language, prose and all this. Just give me the nuts and bolts of architecture and of mathematics. And he was very skilled at that. So perhaps we're indebted to him for things like Exodus 25 through 40 that deal so much with the furniture of the tabernacle. Exodus 25 through 40. He was married in January of 1603. So he was one of the few who carried an extra burden into his translating work. Number 7, John Overall. John Overall. O-V-E-R-A-L-L. 1560 to 1619, age 44, Doctor, Dean of St. Paul's. He's one of the better known of the first group of translators. So we put him there with Lancelot Andrews as one that we have more information on. John Overall. The other names will slip from your memory. Some of these will stand out more. Biography. He came from a poor, orphaned childhood, but by the year 1596 he held the divinity chair of Hebrew at Cambridge. In 1602 he became Dean of St. Paul's. And here he found a great problem awaiting him. The nave, Paul's Walk it was called there, and part of the church outside, was a hangout for swindlers and pickpockets and drunks and prostitutes, etc. The vile human throngs here in the nave, Paul's Walk, at St. Paul's, were so infamous that Shakespeare wrote of them in Henry IV, Part 2. That's how famous this nave was at St. Paul's for all of its swindlers and pickpockets, drunks and prostitutes. Shakespeare wrote of it in Henry IV, Part 2. Overall, cleaned it up rather quickly, so he did a very good job whenever he finally came as Dean of St. Paul's in 1602. He had several churches under him, so his income was rather good. So good that by the age of 44, right at the time of translating work, he took to himself a wife, Anne Orwell, described as the greatest beauty in England in April of 1604. Remember, very few of the men are married. We just covered 2 now, 2 in a row, 2 consecutively who are married. So they were the most recent newlyweds among the translators. Just married the spring all of this comes out. 44-year-old John Overall and his new wife, Anne Orwell. The greatest, described in that day as the greatest beauty in England. But after a few years and during the translating work, she ran away with another man. Friends of Overall chased the lovers down a London lane and dragged her back home to her husband. And evidently she stayed put after that. You have no more reference of Overall's friends chasing his wife. So surely that would influence him as he's trying to do translating work and his wife is running away from him. I don't know what portion he got stuck with, but I'm sure it was a juicy one. He actually knew very little Hebrew. Yes, he held a divinity chair of Hebrew, but he knew very little Hebrew. He was a great Latin scholar. So great that when he was asked to preach before the Queen, he replied, and I quote, "I have spoken Latin so long, it is troublesome to speak English." That's how fluent he was, not only a scholar, but how fluent he was in Old Latin. St. Paul's happened to be just 2 miles from Westminster, so he could easily make it there, either by walking or by taking the riverboat down the Thames. Very convenient for Overall then. Just 2 miles from Westminster. He could either walk there or take the riverboat down the Thames. Now, something I said earlier, and I said we would return to. 4 of the Roman Catholics condemned in the gunpowder plot were hanged in St. Paul's courtyard at the end of January in 1606. And John Overall may well have watched them hang. Again, that would influence. When I say influence, it's not like I'm meaning for you to sit out there and think, well, I wonder what verse I can turn to and get the more proper meaning out of it. I'm just trying to show you that the Bible, like it is in the KJV, didn't come down with the finger of angels behind it. I mean, I do things during the day, probably that influences. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Something I say or don't say that night because of something I did that day. In other words, all I'm trying to show you is the humanness of it all, because people have such an elevated view of the KJV as though it is the and the only inspired Word of God. But he may have been doing a little work, and he heard all the clamor out in the courtyard and stuck his head out the window and watched a couple of guys swing by their necks out there. And then go back to doing his translating work on the love of God or the mercy of God or something. Surely that's going to affect him and his thoughts. Let's hope he stays faithful to the text, but it's going to affect him. On May the 3rd, at the same place, St. Paul's courtyard, it is certain that he did attend another hanging. We're not for sure about those in January of 1606, but in May of that year, the 3rd day of that month, it is certain that he did attend another hanging from the same episode, the gunpowder plot. And this was one of Henry Garnet, who was thought to be the head of the Jesuits in England, but who actually had no part in the plot. But he did know about it, though. We know that Overall went out, he stopped his translating work, he went out and preached the gospel to this man and tried to get him to repent, but he would not. Of course, they would have still wrapped the cord around his neck anyway, but he wanted him to go to his Maker in peace. So we know Overall did get interrupted in this translating work and went and preached to this man, Henry Garnet. Tried to get him to repent, but he wouldn't. John Overall is the man who wrote the section on the sacraments in the Book of Common Prayer Catechism. He wrote another famous book on the divine right of kings. Here he taught no episcopacy, no presbytery had control over the king. You'd think that James would like that. Actually, James did not like the word because in it, in some places, he implied that successful rebellions against a monarchy may actually, after all, be from the hand of God. So the book, although he wrote it during this time, was not finally published until 1688, many years after his death. He became Bishop of Norwich in 1618. One other note, he was an Arminian in theology. Some of these men are Calvinists, some are Arminian, and of course some we don't know. Most of these men, as you can probably see, are Anglicans. Number 8, Hadrian Severia. We discussed him before as the oldest translator in any of the groups. Hadrian Severia. Doctor, Canon of Canterbury, 73 years old at the time of translation, so he was born in 1531. He lived 2 years after the KJV came out. He died in 1613. We've mentioned him before as being the oldest translator. He was also different in that it was very unusual for a foreigner like him to rise to such heights. He was a Frenchman, born in France of a Spanish father and Flemish mother. He lived in the Low Countries until the religious situation caused him to leave for England. Then he returned to Holland, one of the Low Countries, and became professor of divinity, and then returned to England the second time for good, where he lived out his life. He was a very strict high churchman, liturgy, great defender of the episcopacy. And he even sparred some with Theodore Beza when the latter proposed abolishing the episcopacy in Scotland. He's one of 3 translators who mentioned America somewhere in their writings. Remember, Layfield had actually been there to the West Indies. He's the only one to have traveled there. But Severia was one of 3 men who actually mentioned America in their writings. But he did so with great dislike. Too foreign, too savage for him. However, one of his books marked him as the earliest Protestant to argue in favor of the importance of foreign missions. So he's somewhat, not a grandfather of missiology, but somewhat of a figurehead in early foreign mission studies. As far as we know, he's the earliest Protestant to argue in favor of the importance of foreign missions. That just wasn't really thought of. Missionary activity entered its heyday in the 19th century and continues up into the 20th. But here at the turn of the 17th century, not a lot of people are thinking of foreign missions. He had assisted in the drafting of the Belgic Confession, the great Belgic Confession in 1561. One of his pet peeves was that the term apostle or apostles in the New Testament actually meant bishops and should so be translated, which shows his Anglican background right away. And by the way, with English not being his born, native given tongue, it's a little surprising to see him as a translator of the greatest of English Bibles, because that's not his native tongue. He obviously knew English, But it's one thing for you to know it later in life, and it's another thing for it to be your given, born native tongue. But he probably was invited because he was such a good scholar, such great linguistic abilities in general. He spoke many different languages himself. Let's see, we've got a few more moments. Let's finish this group and then we'll be through tonight. Number 9, Richard Thompson. Thomson. Richard Thompson. He was a Mr. taught at Clare Hall, Cambridge. And his nickname was the Dutch. First Old Testament group, Genesis to Kings, meeting at Westminster, popularly called the Dutch because he was from Holland, but born of English parents there. His contemporaries referred to him as, and I quote, a debauched, drunken English Dutchman. His contemporaries referred to him as a debauched, drunken English Dutchman. Well, at least he wasn't on the New Testament committee that had to do Ephesians 5:18, be not drunk with wine. He safely was in the Old Testament that is filled with its stories on drunkenness and wine. But remember from our introduction to the affairs of the conference in general, that most of these men were heavy, heavy drinkers. That just was a way of the times. But he's the only one actually referred to as a drunk. He was an Arminian. I wonder if one affected the other. And finally, number 10, last man in this committee, Robert Tighe. T-I-G-U-E. He was a Mr. Archdeacon of Middlesex.